Looking forward to getting started today with you. If folks want to go around and introduce themselves, I know Craig Bolio is not able to join us today, and I am Emily Kornheiser, and I'm here representing the Vermont House of Representatives.
Hi, good morning. I'm Zoe Saunders, Secretary of Education.
Hi, I'm Nicole Mace. I'm on the Winooski Board of Trustees, and I'm here representing the Vermont School Boards Association.
Good morning, Mike Licklider, Superintendent of the Harwood Unified Union School District, here representing the Vermont Superintendents Association.
And I'm Elizabeth Jennings from Addison Northwest School District. I am the Director of Finance and Operations there, and I'm here representing VASBO, the Vermont Association of School Business Officials.
Thank you, everyone. And so today, our agenda starts with approving our meeting minutes, hearing from the public, a discussion and final review of our policy grid before we hand it off to the full commission, a break, which will be lovely, a discussion of 2 documents that the Agency of Education has shared with us, and then wrapping up with a discussion, probably the beginning of a discussion on lessons learned from previous reform efforts that we want to carry into this next phase in our work on behalf of Vermonters. Ask members of the public who, any members of the public, anyone who's not a member of the committee, to please keep their cameras off and themselves muted as they are attending the meeting, unless you are testifying. Any amendments to the agenda anyone recommends, requests, wishes for? Okay. And the meeting minutes then.
I move that we adopt the meeting minutes from the previous meeting.
Thank you. Anyone like to second that? Thank you, Nicole. Any discussion? All those in favor of approving the meeting minutes, please say something like
Aye.
yes. Thank you.
Aye.
Aye. And with that, our minutes are approved. Thank you, everyone. And thank you especially to the note takers for the meeting minutes and the really great team supporting the committee and the commission from AOE. Next up, we have hearing from the public. If you would like to speak, please raise your hand. I'm going to give a minute for a couple of folks to raise their hands, and then I will call on you in the order of your hands being raised. Okay, we have Jean Albert. If you'd like to turn on your camera and unmute and share your thoughts with us.
Good morning. Hope you can hear me. It's great to see everybody, and thank you for this opportunity. I saw that you would be discussing the policy grid that was generated from your brainstorm exercise, and it's a new version, as far as I can see, from some prior ones that had been posted and discussed. And I wanted to first thank you in broad terms for a commitment to data and evidence. I think that's really going to be critical moving forward in any recommendations, suggestions, any potential actions that you feel would be appropriate and beneficial for the legislature to consider. I can see in the new version of the of this grid that some of the prior comments in which your assessment about a fiscal impact for certain options, that your assessment was either that the fiscal impact might be unclear or that you were unsure, have been omitted, as far as I can tell, at least with respect to, say, merging of districts or other considerations. Optimal school size, I believe, would be another one. And I want to encourage you to, as much as possible, include assessments such as those. There is, in many cases, really no data yet to support those conclusions that the fiscal impact would be beneficial. The information that I shared with the full commission last week provides some preliminary indication in those two cases that I just mentioned, merging and in particular closing schools, does not have the fiscal impact one might think it would have. In any case, I really do want to encourage you to convey to the legislature in as clear as terms as possible that further study really is needed. And then one just last comment on that, in that category, is even in situations where costs are reduced for after a particular option is taken or consideration is taken, that does not necessarily mean that those costs are not shifted in a different form to different constituents. And a great example of that I can think of is when a school is reconfigured or closed, often that leads to longer ride times on a bus, which means that financial costs that may be reduced are then shifted to other types of costs that are borne by children and families. And there is recent evidence, just in the last few years, research on that very question about whether longer times on a bus has a negative impact on academic achievement and social and psychological well-being of students. And I just wouldn't want to for the commission to make the kinds of even suggestions without further study that could lead in directions that are sort of counter to other policy objectives that we have. So that's my comment this morning, and good luck.
Thank you very much. Anyone else like to share with us? And as I'm sure folks who are here are aware, the commission has a much more robust public participation schedule and opportunities than we do on this committee. But I see you, David. Would you like to participate?
Good morning. Yeah, I hope I'm anticipating your thinking in my comment this morning. As you all know, your charge in the legislation is to deliver a written report containing its preliminary findings and recommendations, including short-term cost containment considerations for the 25 legislative session. And I want to encourage you to limit what you do report right now, to not report the whole grid, but limit it to those short-term considerations. A recent Digger article has already said that the subcommittee is slated to deliver the recommendations this month. And I think if you go beyond that, you take a chance of risking your credibility. You've all spoken about the importance of retaining high credibility, the committee and all the commissioners. And people have repeatedly said that you don't want to present anything that cannot be backed up with data. And a spreadsheet full of ideas that have not been examined is not preliminary findings and recommendations. In fact, some that have been examined have been discredited by data already. And this would be in direct contradiction to your statements about credibility and supported with data. Presenting them with disclaimers will not prevent them from being seen as recommendations. And I think you all know that's true. You're familiar enough with the media and the politics around all of these issues. That's why you're doing this work to begin with. If you believe there's a value in sharing the results of your brainstorm, and I think there is, then publish the screenshots and the stickies. They would not be confused as recommendations. But more importantly, I think if you want to retain credibility and avoid early reactions and confusion and criticism for presenting what will be seen as politically motivated proposals, and if you want to avoid that, limit the list to the short-term cost containment considerations for the legislative session. The legislature will do its work whether they see the results of your brainstorm or not. But the charge for right now is for the short-term cost containment considerations. I strongly require, I don't know why, I hope you will do that and not go down the what's going to be clearly seen as the first politically motivated action by the commission. Thanks.
Thank you, David. Nice to see you. Anyone else? Okay, I think both of those were a robust introduction to our first agenda item. And before we jump into it, I want to speak not as the chair of this committee, but as the chair of the House Ways and Means Committee for a minute and share why I am really excited about the work of this grid. So sort of in the great journey of education policy reform and education finance reform, which are two separate things that are inextricably tied together, right? And one of my largest pieces of gratitude in the commission's work and our work is how much everyone has highlighted that those two pieces are inextricably tied together and somewhat separate. And that discernment, I think, is going to be a really important piece of how we begin the year. So I think everyone understands that the political reality is that something, the legislature is going to do something this year. And then that work is going to start at the very beginning of the session with the House Ways and Means Committee and the House Education Committee. Because the issues of taxes and education policy are inextricably tied together, it's going to need to start in the House and not the Senate, because tax issues start in the House and the yield bill starts in the House. And it would be, we set up this commission and asked for these recommendations as a legislature because we did not want to be doing our work in a vacuum. We wanted it to be driven by feedback from the field, by the thoughts and perspectives of all of you as leaders in the particular slice of the system that you represent. And all of the ideas in this spreadsheet are ideas that are live. They are live in the ether, whether we want them to be or not. And what I think was extraordinary about the process of putting it together is we really sort of combined 15 different brainstorms from 15 different places that were all essentially the exact same brainstorm. And as I've been talking to my colleagues and getting really an extraordinary quantity of email on this issue, it is the exact same ideas that come up over and over again. And I think, Nicole, at the very beginning of our work together, you pointed out that Julia Richter, who was asked to put together from the Joint Fiscal Office, was asked to put together a report and with all these ideas in it. And it is also that same list of ideas. And so no matter what, and the political reality is that we have a lot of new members. We have a lot of members that were elected in the context of this issue. And they're all coming with their brainstorm of ideas, right? Like, again, whether we want this to be true or not, this is the political reality that we're all swimming in. And when we start the session, no matter what the commission officially recommended, all of those ideas would still be alive because that's the nature of politics and that's the nature of this world that we're swimming in. And one of the things that's really hard about education, right? Because it's something that everyone knows a lot about and everyone knows a very different thing from everyone else because we actually do have quite varied educational opportunities from district to district and community to community. And over the last 50 years, that's changed, right? And so it will be extraordinarily helpful to have us as a legislature not begin our work in a vacuum with a brand new brainstorm. And as I think we talked about a couple meetings ago, if we eliminate ideas now, they are just going to be reintroduced as soon as the session starts, and they'll be reintroduced without the value that this group has put into this conversation. And so I think it's really important and really helpful that we have all of this thinking, because none of these ideas are perfect. They all have, I'm going to stop talking in a second. I'm sorry for the lecture, everyone. They all have significant trade-offs, every single one of them. And every single one of them has a body of evidence for and against it from like deep data. And every single one is going to take significant changes, significant sacrifices, and create significant opportunities. And so it's the discussion of the trade-offs rather than the one perfect solution that I think we've all navigated quite well together. And I think the legislature is going to pick up. And so there are pieces in this table that I absolutely do not want to see become law personally. And I think that's true of everyone in this room. And I think it's true, you know, and we might all have different ones, but the conversation is still so much alive that I think it's way too early for us to be eliminating anything, because we have not had time to dive into any of these enough to recommend one or the other. And so, Michael, I wonder if you could remind me of the exact words that the commission chose, because it's not a recommendation that you all are planning on putting forward. It's something else.
All right, now you caught me off guard.
I know, I'm so sorry.
Sorry, and I'm having trouble coming up with it. I'll have to go back. Elizabeth or Zoe or Nicole, are you recalling what wording we discussed last week?
And Megan is here too if she wants to show up as well.
And it was, I think, Megan's comment that she made.
I may not have the word correct, but we have been using the word considerations.
Yes, thank
That's
you.
it.
I love that word. I think that is a perfect evocative summary of what these are, that they are considerations, not recommendations. And in my conversations, even with the media over the last week, it felt like they understood that. Nicole, go ahead. I'm off my soapbox. And then Zoe.
I appreciate the soapbox. I think it is reflective of where we've come in this process in terms of why, I'll speak for myself, why I support including the array of policy ideas that have been put on the table, recognizing that the association would not support, you know, everything that's been put on the list. But when you start taking one thing off, you can take multiple things off. One question that came up at the commission's meeting that I would be interested in your reflections at some point is the role of this committee during the legislative session. Because, you know, to your point earlier, I think this has been a really healthy conversation that has the perspectives of folks from the field, folks in the legislature, folks in the administration. We haven't gotten to a place where we can dig in deeply into each of these, but I think we've covered a lot of the initial groundwork that's been really important. And I'm hopeful that this can continue to be a structure to start to, as potential consensus starts to emerge around a direction, that this committee can be used as a additional, it's a transparent conversation, it's a public conversation, and it's a little bit less charged than a conversation that might be happening in a committee room, for example. So.
Zoe, do you mind if I respond to that before you jump in? So I think that is actually up to the steering committee to figure out. I mean, I think it would be helpful for us all to have our perspectives, and let's spend some time sort of at the very end of the meeting talking about it. But I think it's actually up to the steering committee to figure out what our role is going forward. Go ahead, Zoe.
Thanks. So at the last commission meeting, I did express some reservations around including this list of ideas in the report. I think regardless of how it's framed, the list will be seen as policy recommendations. And what's challenging about that is that there are a lot of contradictory ideas that are listed. Also, the ideas have not been vetted and they're not based on data. So it doesn't create a coherent set of recommendations. Since the commission meeting, the agency has had a couple of listen and learn tours, and that really, my reservation with including the list has been reinforced because people continue to say, what about the policy ideas that are included on the list that the commission is going to submit? And I just don't think that this brainstorming is at a place to be included in the report. I don't think that the list meets the professional standards that are expected of this type of report from the commission. And I think it's really important that we clarify where we are. I had suggested at the commission meeting that instead of including the list, we reframe that section and identify and describe where we are in this point and call out that there are some underlying tensions around what's the best path forward because this work is really complex. But if the list is included in the report, I will not be able to vote on the report positively because I just do not think that it serves the commission well. And the agency has been really focused on making sure that all of the work products we're putting out there are based on data and research. And I just don't feel like this list is getting us forward.
Would anyone else like to share any thoughts on this?
Yes, I think we need to have some more discussion about the list. I like the idea of including a comprehensive review of the work we've done to date. I think Zoe's comments are well taken, that there is a lot of contradictory information in the report. I think that's very true. Like our chair has said, there's items here that I could not support. But one of the benefits I see in the work that we are doing as a subcommittee, as well as the work the commission is doing, is to put all of those ideas in one arena and then to start sorting them and relating them. So I'll give an example. I know some of the concerns were related to closing schools and merging districts. I can share from my seat as a superintendent that whenever there's conversation at the state level about one of those topics, I hear from the constituents in my school district, why don't we look to close a school? When people hear small schools, they think in different frames of mind. So one of those examples is our smallest school has about 115 students, pre-kindergarten through 6th grade. That's not in the neighborhood of 50 or smaller that some are talking about. There are other variables though. There's different schools in our community. One of the biggest challenges we have is looking at where students would go if we had to close a school, and construction costs, which is also in the report. So as a result, our school board has taken the approach to dive in more deeply to understand all those related areas. And I just see the work that in the conversations we've had, is that something on this level, on a state level, that we have to do to fully understand every aspect of everything listed in the grid. How we do that moving forward is still part of some of our conversations, but I think acknowledging everything that's being talked about in public and making sure that our public sees that we're exploring all those areas is an important first step.
Oh, go ahead, Zoe.
So my suggestion is really shifting this into a narrative form and being able to describe the process and describe the types of strategies that are being considered, and recognizing exactly what Mike just shared, that there's other considerations that would need to be factored in with these holistic approaches. But I think, again, just if we submit a list, those will be the policy ideas that people are focused on. And I think we lose the opportunity to own the complexity of this work and acknowledge that further data and analysis will be needed to come up with a coherent set of recommendations.
Nicole, go ahead. I think there's only 5 of us for now, so I think we can be pretty free flowing until we can't be.
Done. And so I think it's contradictory because this commission has an inherent conflict built into it, which is you have 18 months to articulate a vision for the future of public education, engage the public in what that looks like, and address a large list of complexities as you go through that process. At the same time, within 4 months, we want to report recommending short-term cost containment, which we have as a group decided we're not in a position to make short-term cost containment recommendations because of the complexity, because of the timing. And all that's happening within a political reality that Emily talked about. And so as much as I'm thinking about this commission's initial report, it's really an update to the legislature in terms of the work that's been done. That's how much of the report reads, this is how we've set ourselves up in order to start to tackle some of these, tackle our bigger charge. And so I think this is a pretty accurate picture of the work we've been doing for the past 2 to 3 months. And I feel like capturing that somewhere is important. As Emily said, all of these ideas are out there. All of these are being, many people have an idea that if we just do this thing, we'll be in a better place. And I think the commission's report will clearly say there is no such thing as this thing that's going to solve our problems. But I'm interested, Zoe, in your statement that the administration can't sign on to the commission's report if this is included. I know you expressed reservations last week, but this is sort of, you know, a pretty clear line. And I'm not quite sure what to do with. But I also know that as part of this upcoming legislative session, recognizing that much of the work will start in the House, the Senate has said we're clearing the first 2 weeks of the session to hear from the administration. What are your ideas? And so I'm interested in having a heads up or sense of, like, is the administration planning to say we have more work to do before we can come up with ideas? Or is there going to be a separate slate of proposals being presented that this list conflicts with? You know, I'm just trying to understand from a realistic perspective where the administration is coming from in terms of putting the ideas on the table. And if that's if it's not this, is it something else that we should all be talking about?
So I think in the governor, in the letter, the governor had indicated, the December 1 letter, we'd indicated that there'll be a policy proposal framework that will be shared. But what I would say is that the agency has been engaged very deeply in this work throughout the whole time period. So over the last several months, we've published very comprehensive data reports to understand the current state of our education system, including educational quality and funding considerations. We also released the education funding report that had a comparison to Vermont, how Vermont funds our schools to other states. And in that funding report, there are considerations on a future path forward of some of the kind of large policy ideas to be explored based on data and based on research and an analysis of what's serving us well currently in our system and where there are opportunities to make some improvements that will support educational quality, equity, and sustainability. So I think as we've been going through this whole process as an agency through our Listen and Learn tour and engagement with the commission, we've been publishing our learnings and listenings and wonderings all along the way that are framing up that conversation. And we've really lent our consultants to the commission to provide some additional data analysis and also an overview as we think about the education funding formula and understanding how the foundation formula has evolved over the last several decades, as we've talked about. So I think we've been really, as certainly as an agency of education, really transparent and forthcoming around what we're learning and hearing. What are some of those possible paths forward, while still recognizing, as we all have, that this work is complex and there's a lot of other pieces that need to come into play. The reservation with the list is that there's a lot of inaccuracies in the list. We haven't had an opportunity to really do the vetting that is required, and that's what's concerning to me. And I think we've heard it from the public today as well, that publishing the list will actually undermine the credibility of the commission because that level of vetting and review has not been done. I do think it's a valuable starting point to have as a working document and a grid, but I think we need to take it to another level and really help people understand what it is, what it isn't, and what we've learned from it. Because I think just saying that they're ideas, and even many people saying on this call that they actually don't support some of those ideas. That's a problem. Like we really need to be able, as a commission at this point, knowing that this is going to be the focus of the session, to really have some clearer direction around it based on what we've seen and what we've learned. What do we think is going to be really fundamental to zero in on? In our education funding report, we have some discussion around the future path forward. If that's an area that the commission all feels is still broad enough, I might recommend we look at that as a way to kind of direct next steps.
So this is more of like a formality thought, but I'm a little bit concerned that if we were to change what we were going to put forth at this point into the report, that would contradict the vote that happened in the overall commission meeting last time, because basically it was kind of voted upon whether or not to include the whole grid or not, or to edit the grid or to change how it was being done. And overall, the vote was to include it. I know that the room was quite split, but it actually was approved to put the whole thing in. So I'm just like, formality wise, irrelevant of what our opinions are in this group, do we even really have the opportunity to change that at this point? I'm just wondering.
Yeah, it was funny too how the room was split, right? We were all kind of joking around,
right where
like
we were sitting,
divided, right, based on where you were sitting. It's kind of like a lunchroom cafeteria dynamics. But what I also heard, and I think I was charged with helping to do the framing, right? So helping to really think about how we can put this into a narrative form around how we came to these ideas. And again, I think calling out that, there are, the list is contradictory in nature, and it's contradictory in nature because we're coming with different perspectives, right, around the best path forward, and there's tension there, right? I mean, just as simple as adding new revenue versus really trying to think around how we create efficiencies and effectiveness within the system and our current funding, right? So I think being able, maybe in this conversation today, looking at the list and thinking about kind of as we look through this, couple key takeaways. One that I think we've all agreed on is that it's not a one solution, right? That this complex challenge requires a multifaceted and complex solution. And that also within this, I think there's further data and analysis that may be required in order to really land on what set of recommendations would make the most sense. And then lastly, I think we've talked about this a lot in the commission, is that there is a lot of community nuance across the state of Vermont. And so a one size fits all will likely not work, right? But thinking about how do we understand the framework and really being clear around what are the objectives that we're trying to achieve, and describing those types of adjustments that may be needed depending on certain community and demographic needs of Vermont. So I think what might be helpful is if we look at this list and think about, okay, what are these underlying challenges? What are the things that we really need to begin to address and answer, because all of those assumptions will have to go into the final policy proposal that the commission recommends. And I think we need to push ourselves to at least naming where those tensions exist, because we'll need to really make them explicit and make some decisions around how do we really address those underlying challenges in a way that's going to move us forward as a state. I think just the list itself doesn't do that. I think it's really our job to take it to the next level and be able to articulate what we're seeing in this list, what we're not seeing in the list, and why it's challenging to come to that holistic recommendation.
So I think that, yes, I agree with you. And today is December 9th. The report is due on December 15th. And the legislature is going to, and the governor is going to start moving on this in the next 3 weeks, 4 weeks, right? No matter what we do here and no matter what the commission does. And you all on the commission have put in an enormous amount of labor, like in excess of your core job descriptions, right? Like you are, it's a huge sacrifice and a huge gift to the state that you all are that we're all doing this. And I want the commission to, like, as you said, Zoe, to stay like relevant in addition to producing good work products. And I think I think just a narrative process update is a big risk to make the commission irrelevant to the conversation. And I agree that there's a lot more that needs to be added to make this a policy document. I'm like motioning to my other monitor here to make this a policy document. And privately, as I prepare for the session, I have added a column for regional differences and political considerations and questions that would need to be answered that aren't data questions or sort of implementation questions and trade-offs, right? We had that column already, like some of these are trade-offs with each other. Also, they all need to be lined up in the context of like a significant implementation plan, because there are like even, if 5 of them were implemented, but the timelines aren't matched up for the implementation, we could do really significant damage, right? So all of that needs to happen before any of this becomes law. But if we don't really I'm concerned that if we don't stand firmly in the moment that we happen to be in right now, we are at risk of sort of losing the thread of the conversation.
And we just changed the name of the document. I mean, we're calling it policy, and it's, I know that we're discussing policy in all of those conversations, but can we call it the brainstorm of the finance committee, subcommittee, or something that's different, but reflects what it actually is?
I agree with that. And the conflict I have is that whether we include this or not, this is a public document, it exists, and it's going to still continue to guide our discussions. So by not acknowledging it, we also run the risk of people criticizing the work that's been done. So I've heard now the chair of the House Ways and Means Committee say it's helpful. I've heard the chair of the Senate Finance Committee say it's helpful as a starting point, but also that a lot of work needs to happen from here before we can really put this policy into place. And I also think back to the comments that Emily has made before to our group that even with some of those long-term pieces, the work has to start next month. So I think we need to acknowledge the work that we've done, and that there's still plenty of work to do in the coming 12 months.
I'm also just want to express, I understand that there are a lot, more than most, I understand the scale of politics that are involved in this, right? Like, and the work we do here is like absolutely transcends politics, transcends anyone's one solution winning the day. Like, this is our children and our communities, and if there was ever a moment to put politics aside, it is this issue. And there is a framework that's set up for these conversations where, you know, from my perspective, like the best and brightest appointed from every corner of this field have been asked to come together and do this. And it is really excruciatingly frustrating to me that the governor is talking about a framework being proposed totally outside of this process. It feels incredibly disrespectful to all of the people who've been doing this work. And I think puts at risk all of the sort of time, labor, energy, and really what feels to me like profound good faith that folks have sort of channeled into this effort so far. I don't want us to be engaged in multiple parallel processes, and I feel like I'm one of the people who has a lot of a role to play in keeping us from parallel process. And so I've been really trying to commit to my colleagues in the House, along with Peter Conlin, that like we are going to be following sort of the next thread from this group, because that is how things were set up in statute. And that's going to be hard because like we didn't start with what is the problem we're trying to solve, because we didn't have the data yet to do that, right? So we are like, this is a naturally reactive process, and it's better to be engaged in a proactive process, but we are where we are. And we are only going to improve the lives of like kids and taxpayers and our system if we're all like rowing in the same direction and acknowledging that this is complex and messy, and we're going to get things wrong, but I hope we get things wrong at the right step in the process. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, as someone who has dedicated an extraordinary amount of time, I think I'm on 3 bodies, midst of some of you, and to this, I don't want it to be a waste of time. I do believe deeply in having collaboration is the only way through this. And I'm appreciative, Zoe, of the work. As you said, the agency has been engaged. We've received a lot of information. It almost feels like breadcrumbs sort of leading us someplace, but we haven't had a recommendation from the agency around like, here we've been looking at this, we have consultants, we've been hearing from the field, here are the pieces that we think need to be the starting point, right? So I would welcome that as we go through. I don't know what the best use of our time, but is it digging into this and having you say, this isn't, you know what I mean, or to give us more than sort of the trail of breadcrumbs that may be leading us someplace that is the framework that the governor is going to be presenting, to like concretely, this seems like a red herring. This seems like a waste of time. We really feel like we need to focus in this upcoming session on A, B, C. I think then this group can talk about that. That would help us focus. I think what's been hard, it's been hard to focus because everybody has a constituency that they represent. Everybody has a hat that they wear. That may or may not make it difficult for them to say, push one or the other. So the idea was it's all going to get put on the table. It's all going to be talked about. Because otherwise, and I've participated in dozens of these kinds of groups over my years in Vermont. And what happens is lines get drawn in the sand, reports get produced that have minority reports, and nothing happens. I want something to happen because I think public education needs it. And the only way I see forward is that it be done in an environment of trust and collaboration. I think that's what this is. I'm hopeful that that's what this is. If it's not, then I think we all need to consider why we're devoting all this time to it. So I'm interested in how do we narrow the field?
Yeah, and I'm not exactly clear on where the frustration is coming from, because I think in my role and with the agency support, we've been very collaborative, and I think we've all acknowledged that this work is complex, right? A lot of what we've been doing over the last several months is to just kind of set the table, right? Like, what is the data showing us? And then when we recognized that we needed to go deeper and we needed to do some data validation, we did that, right? And then as we started thinking about how is our actual funding system structured, we look to other states, right? And I think what we were able to see is we're really unique in ways that may not serve us as well right now. And what we did in that the education funding report is we laid it out, right? This is exactly how we're structured. This is how it's similar, how it's different, right? And so what I was hopeful is really for the commission to be able to engage with that report a little differently and be able to kind of walk through the sections and be like, okay, what does this part mean, right? Like, so if we think about just our timeline in general, if we were able, because we've talked about the fact that our school budgeting cycle starts earlier and ends earlier than other states. We just talked about how we could switch that timeline. That would be incredible, right? But how we could switch, the only way we can really switch the timeline is if we think about how we fund education differently, right? And then that's when we start looking at those different models, and we started to have those conversations as we look through the foundation formula. We talked to within that report around how we achieve scale, right, in meaningful ways, and that not just being about cost, but being about education quality, and talk to you about staffing, really thinking about not just staffing from, again, a budgeting perspective, but staffing from the perspective of really how are we making sure that we have the workforce we need in the state to fill the positions. We have significant turnover in a lot of our roles. We have challenges recruiting teachers and special educators. And so it's not just a budget question. There's a lot of these other programmatic and recruitment and retention strategies that are part of this. And so, I was hoping we could spend a little bit more time kind of digging into those sections, because to be very candid, I still have a lot of wonderings, right? This is really big work. We've tried to kind of lay out all the pieces on the table, but I feel like that's a really important starting point, is even going through those sections and saying, okay, we are different in this particular way that the report's describing. Is that a way we need to continue to be different, or is that a way that we can look at making some enhancements, and what are those considerations? So I feel that what the agency's been able to produce, both with the data report and the education funding report, provides a really helpful framework for us to engage in that conversation and to extrapolate further around what we might want to narrow in on in terms of policy considerations based on what we're finding. I'd shared at the last commission meeting that I worry a little bit about analysis paralysis, right? We have a lot of data, we do need more, and we need to refine that. But the big trends are holding, and they have held for a very long time in the state. And so now it's thinking about what are some concrete ways where we feel we can make improvements to this system that promotes the goals of education quality, equity, and sustainability. And I think that the agency has produced a framework for us to engage in that conversation. And I would acknowledge that there's still a lot of complexity there that I would really hope the commission and this particular committee help us to zero in on, because it is enormously complex. And even when we put it in simple terms, when you start to actually think about, well, what would that look like in practice if we were able to change the way that our timing of our funding or how we fund it, it's enormously complex. And so I would just hope that we get into those conversations, and for the purpose of today, getting back to the concrete around the list or not the list, I think there's already transparency that these ideas are being entertained. The question is, when we think about the level of importance of this report, it's how are we going to frame that section in a way that is really capturing where we are, referencing that there's a list of brainstorm ideas. But I think just by including a list of ideas and this level of a report, it will take on a higher it will be seen as policy recommendations, which I know we can do all the framing that we want to do, and we've all been trying. And even when I was in the listen and learn last week, I'm like, these are just ideas. People are seeing them as policy recommendations, and we just need to note that and reference that this is a brainstorm of ideas, but push ourselves today, I think, to go through what are the key takeaways that we have by looking at this report. Like, what do we think are going to be most critical in order to focus in the conversation and narrow our policy review?
And when you talk about this report, you mean the Ed Finance report?
So sorry for the list. I meant for, as we're talking about as a commission, what do we want to provide to the General Assembly? And I think that a lot of the debate around this has been to include a list or not to include a list, right? Because everyone's understanding that we're at an interesting point where it's not all fleshed out. And I think the timing is incredibly challenging, right? So what I would suggest that we do is look at the list today and think about what we feel are the major takeaways from that list and how we can articulate that within the report in a narrative form that references there's a list of brainstorm ideas that's total transparency for people to look at. But I just think we need to recognize that if you put a list in a report that goes to the General Assembly, it takes on a whole other level of importance that I don't think we're ready for those ideas to be in prime time.
Yeah, I think just to clarify, I think the frustration piece that you said you're not sure where the frustration comes from. I think it comes from the idea that a proposal might be brought forward by the governor in 3 weeks that hasn't been talked about by this group, because I'm assuming if there is a framework, it is one that pulls a lot of the pieces together from Listen and Learn, from the Ed Finance report, which I would welcome. And I would welcome a conversation. And I think it's been hard. We haven't had that because of this timeline and this report we have to produce. All the energy of the commission has been focused on what should we say, or what should we include and what should we not include. And there's been a real reluctance to take things off the table at this point because we don't have anything there's no sort of clear proposal or set of proposals to respond to.
And the other things I think is helpful for us to discuss and debate and argue about in this setting, because that's part of the process. And I'm paraphrasing some remarks from the governor last week, but acknowledging that superintendents have some really good ideas that are similar to some of our ideas. And I'm not sure where those intersection is, but they're the things that I'd like to talk about, because I can say I've been a superintendent for a long time in Vermont for just a couple of years, but just from conversations I had with colleagues last year when budgets started to fail, when we had some challenges, when we started to see the realization of the challenges and some of the affordability issues, there started to be a lot of conversations about how we need to do things differently. And from having meetings from our association, there's been a lot of willingness, I think, to look at things differently in a way that many of my colleagues have said have not existed before. And again, this is kind of one of those small think tanks where we can have multiple people from different perspectives, and that's the reason why I was interested in being part of this commission. And I know that's why our association was part of being this commission. And I think as we go into the new calendar year and the new legislative session, it's going to be important to start thinking in bigger terms about what that larger vision for public education is in Vermont, and making sure that it's not a scattershot of ideas, that there is a framework, an educational framework, policy framework, a financial framework, and that we start to operate within that area to come up with a report next year, which I think is going to be critical. But again, a lot of that work is going to start in January. So I think we have to be prepared to respond now, and we need to be prepared to, like I said, argue among ourselves from our perspectives and make those proposals more sound and better, because our children depend on a strong educational system, and that's why I'm here.
I want to offer that as the chair trying to organize this conversation, I really went quite far out of my way to give everyone opportunities to contribute to this anonymously, so that folks would not feel tied and risking sort of the political blowback on their organization or on themselves for throwing in both the good ideas, but also pushing back on the bad ideas. And so everyone had multiple opportunities to submit information to then be combined into a collective whole. And my hope was that both the discussion and the second previous column that was like trade-offs or something like that, I don't remember what it's called, that those two columns were actually the opportunity to say like, we probably don't need to add new revenue, or there's no capacity for this, or implementing this would be technically impossible, or like all of the, or this is a 20-year plan, not a 2-year plan, or this would work in some areas, but not other areas. Like that, there have been multiple opportunities throughout this time to put those questions out there and to do it in a way that was as neutral as possible. There is a lot more that needs to be figured out about all of this. And like, frankly, most of it needs to have like significant modeling attached to any of it, which is why I think we all knew from the very beginning of our process that there was no universe where we were going to have real recommendations ready, right? But to lose the work in just discussing dynamics, again, I think puts us at risk of total irrelevance. And it's too late to really add more to the grid. So I'm gonna recommend, if anyone has, I'd love if anyone has any final thoughts on sort of this process piece, I'd love to hear that. And then I'm gonna take a break and figure out what we're gonna do after that.
I go back to a comment Elizabeth made that I do think we have to have this discussion at the commission level. We did take a vote on the grid. I think we need to take a look we need to be open-minded and take a look at what the final report, draft report is. I'm really interested in seeing Zoe's sections that she's going to contribute. And I want to take a look at what those recommendations are before I make a final decision. So I think the grid is at a good place right now. I think it still needs work, but I'd like to see that in conjunction with the final draft report next week.
And am I correct that we determined when we voted on including the grid or not to include the grid, that we were including it not in the body, but as an addendum or an attachment? Is that correct? Yeah. So it was moved out of like the main body of the document, but as referenced and as an attachment addendum to the document.
Yes.
And I just want to clarify a couple of things. So the governor has been asked to provide a proposal that is built, that absolutely needs to be comprehensive and built upon the best ideas that have been emerging over the last several years, and also through the work of the commission. The agency has been really an active partner in this work, along with the tax department, is as we're learning and noticing things, we're bringing it to the commission as part of the discussion. And we've published several reports that are very comprehensive in analyzing the needs and analyzing the opportunities, along with providing a high-level framework for this conversation. So I think all of the work that the governor is doing in terms of developing this proposal are not new ideas. These are things that we've all been having conversations around and are really collaborative in nature, and also increasing the level of engagement and being able to provide communications directly to education leaders over the last several months and getting some additional feedback that way, right? So I think we're all trying to bring these pieces together, not as a way to surprise, but as a way to pull all the threads together, and that's absolutely the intent. And the agency, through their work, has shared a framework that continues to evolve as we get input and we think through the complexity together in this work on the commission. So I just wanted to make sure that that was clarified.
Muted again. Let us take a break. It's just a couple minutes before we were scheduled to. And so we are going to take a break until 11:20. And I'll see y'all back here.
For those who might have just joined, this committee is recessed until 11:20.
Welcome back. Hello. Hope everyone had a delightful break. Really glad I remembered to put wood on the fire, which is always very hard for me when I'm in meetings all day until I get very cold and realize the fire's almost gone out. So that's my great success for the day. I hope you all have one. So, curious what people would rather do for our next steps on the agenda. Two choices, which I think are both good choices, are we could shift the agenda around so the next agenda item is to go through this line by line and see what we do think is missing. The other option is that we release ourselves from this for now, say we got as far as we could on the spreadsheet and instead turn to our originally scheduled agenda item, which is to hear about the Vermont State Profile Report in greater depth. And for that, Zoe, I would need you to be willing to take us through the Vermont State Profile Report in greater depth as our next agenda item. So I'm sorry to. Will you say that again? I didn't catch it. I'm sorry.
I said I'll cue that up. And
thoughts? Yeah, Elizabeth, Nicole.
I would also, I think we're not going to make much progress on that chart, particularly given Zoe's reservations about including it at all. It doesn't seem like a great use of our time to be going through it. But I would welcome, whether it's the state profile report, I think the ed finance report that came out is particularly relevant to this group's work. Seems like it's, providing a lot of the basis for how the agency is thinking about this. When I read it, I thought it was a very good place for us to be focusing. So I think that's where I would, any sort of changes in the report that sort of connect to the findings of the finance piece, I think are going to be most helpful in terms of good use of our time.
So Nicole, I hear you offering a third option, which is great. This is not a criticism. I just want to clarify where we are in the conversation. That third option that we talk about the ed finance report in depth, which I think would also be very useful. I will say that the one thing I don't want to do is go through the data request spreadsheet because I think it's really important that it gets matched up to these policy suggestions, and I don't think it's the right time for that.
I'm in agreement with Nicole on the ed finance report.
I was going to say the same thing, and then I know, Emily, you have at the end planning for future meetings. There's some other wonderings I have for reports that I'd like to talk about at the end for discussion at future meetings as well.
Okay. Zoe, does that sound okay to you? The person who actually has to do this?
Sure. So I did not prepare a formal presentation around this for today, but I certainly can walk through it, and I think it would be helpful because this is, how we're thinking about the framework, right? So as the agencies approach this work, it's really thinking about the long-term transformation strategies, and there are some opportunities to talk about short-term cost containment. That has not been as much of the focus as thinking about the broad framework, right? And I think this report helps us to really solidify our thinking and put it in a frame of context that is helpful relative to how other states compare and what we might be able to pull to be supportive. I can share my screen, and so I think is the idea to walk what I thought I could do as you were describing the ask here is just to kind of walk through some of the high-level sections and highlight some of the key components that were looked at, and then also to look at the future considerations framing. So as I say that, I'm going to retract that. I think the best place to start is in the future framing section and just walk through some of the key components and then go back to those sections so we can provide some background around what we learned through this process around our system and where there may be opportunities to make improvements to achieve our goals. Would that work?
That sounds
Is it safe to say we've all read the report? Because I don't
yes,
want to
and
that, but I think you should assume, you know,
Okay.
the sort of for me, the more the connections can be made to like, here's where we think we really need to dig in, or this gives us some fodder for future analysis and discussion, calling that out and really so we can sort of note that and if possible discuss it would be really helpful. As opposed to sort of taking us through the report.
I agree. I'm sorry, Emily, go ahead.
I thank you. I think screen sharing is incredibly helpful because it centers us in the conversation. And agreed, while we've all read it, it is like there are lots of people tuning in too. So some degree of sort of high level is helpful, and the digging, like what next steps you see in each of these is helpful. Go ahead, Mike, sorry.
I was going to say, I think it's important to note that I think we all did read it, but yes, not everyone who may be watching has. And I heard you mention, Zoe, earlier, just some conversation about budgeting timelines and pieces like that. And I'd be curious in your reflections, as well as what's in the report, acknowledging that you weren't prepared. This wasn't a conversation that you were prepared for, so I wanted to acknowledge that as well.
Thank you. Appreciate that. So I'll just start here. You know, we spend a lot of time. This report is structured in 3 primary sections. The first section is to really explain the education funding system. And we received a number of questions through the Listen and Learn tour. And so we structured that section in terms of a question and answer. So I think for the purpose of today's conversations, we might reflect on that. But I think the more important piece of this would be to focus on how we compare to other states, because that's where we're able to take each component of our education funding system and really put that into context. And that helped to elucidate some insights and potential paths forward. So I'm sharing my screen now. This is the end of the report. We're really clear here to frame this as these are not foregone conclusions, but this is what has emerged as really some promising paths forward. I do think what the commission has reinforced is important, that this is complex work and it is multifaceted. So one of the things we talked about here is that we look at how we fund our education system, and that is inclusive of thinking about the timeline differently and also thinking about the way we distribute funds differently. And so I'll walk through some of those sections that informed our thinking. But right now, our current timeline makes it really challenging for schools and districts to be as strategic as possible. We start earlier and end earlier in our budgeting cycle compared to other states. And the challenge there is that districts and school boards don't have all of the information that they need to think about some of the conversations around what are required for students, like what are the key programmatic needs, what are some things we could factor into if we know some staff members might be retiring, some natural attrition that could be built in. A lot of that's really unknown in the early part of our budgeting cycle and can build some frustrations. We also know that our system is really, really complex, and it's designed that way to promote equity in theory, but what we're seeing in practice is that our lower income communities are not taking advantage of some of the system, and so they're actually spending less on education. So they're kind of counter to the design of being able to allow them to raise additional taxing, have additional taxing capacity. Many of our lower income communities are not taking advantage of that. So what's happening in practice is that we have communities that are struggling to pass the budgets. They're cutting a lot of critical programming. And the concern is that it's going to continue to widen the gap between the haves and the have-nots as we look at our communities across Vermont. So creating greater transparency around how we fund is going to be really important to inform voter decisions and to ensure that resources are allocated in a way that can actually promote equitable opportunities for students across the state. We continue to hear through our Listen and Learn tour that there are many districts that aren't able to offer the range of programming because of budget constraints. And this year, everyone's had another difficult year of budgeting, but the conversations are very different. They're all hard conversations, but we have a scenario right now where districts in our more affluent communities are struggling with making tough decisions around staffing, and instead of maybe having 5 interventionists, having 4 interventionists, which is a really tough call to make because we know those services are really important. And then in our lower income communities, we're having even more challenging conversations where school districts are talking about having to eliminate intramural sports and eliminate elective programming and eliminate programming. And so we're, again, I mean, the types of conversations that we're having or that we're hearing across the state are really reinforcing the need for us to approach this work and to achieve equity. So certainly looking at the overall funding formula and timeline is going to be important in this work. So we do acknowledge that any changes to funding requires a lot of complex thinking and stakeholder involvement and collaboration. Our consultant came to the last Education Finance Subcommittee and talked us through what goes into thinking about a foundation formula. And that work is very complex. It involves a lot of assumptions around the scale, around how we deliver education, what we deliver. All of that needs to be thought through in order for us to arrive at a foundation formula that we think will serve our state well. We also have a lack of budgeting parameters overall compared to other states. And so that creates a lot of volatility within our system in ways that we could be more proactive in managing at the upfront. So I'll go through some of those key sections, but there are a lot of really helpful insights when we compare to other states around how we might approach our budgeting differently. Overall, there's certainly ways for us to think about organizing and structuring our districts to promote scale. There's been a lot of conversations and certainly comments from the community as well around consolidation. We have talked through that in our report. Sometimes that does not equate to large cost savings. It may be a one-time cost saving in some instances. And so the bigger question is thinking about sustainability and thinking about educational programming over time. So I'll kind of walk through that, but there certainly is a conversation around scale that is important for us to think about and involves not just thinking about consolidating schools or districts, but thinking about the actual way in which we staff and deliver services. And we have heard a lot about this balance around a real desire to keep smaller elementary schools in the neighborhood with kind of this demand for more expansive programming in the middle and high schools, and really trying to strike that balance. And then, of course, staffing is really coming through as a critical area of focus. And some of this is because we don't have the workforce right now in Vermont to fill all of the positions we're recruiting for. We continue to hear from principals and superintendents that, 5 years ago they would post for a job and they would get, over 10 applicants, and now they're posting for a job and they are lucky if they get 1 or 2 applicants, right? So we're at a point where we have a lot of staffing positions we're recruiting for, but we don't have the workforce to fill many of those spots, and particularly in our more rural communities as well. And so what that's leading to is a lot of turnover.
Zoe, can I,
Yep.
I don't have a specific question. I have sort of like a thread that I'd love you to weave in, or like a question to discuss at the end or something like that. But when I think about a foundation formula, or I think about moving to larger districts that would be able to have more sustainable, robust quality and programming, when I think about those dynamics and what it would look like to change them, I wonder about the very differing capacity of districts to make those adjustments on their own. budget to a new formula, what the sort of timeline would look like for that, or the capacity to make sure that shifts. And I've sort of heard you say that implicitly, and I would love if it could be like an explicit thread through this conversation, if that's possible.
Yeah, so I think that's a big part of the question, right? So as we finish this report, certainly I think a lot of these pieces make sense intuitively, but in practice, it's really challenging to think about implementation. And certainly there need to be conversations as we move forward around readiness. And I think that's what you're touching on within districts. Like these type of changes are fundamental changes to our education funding system should we go this path. And there will need to be there would need to be a lot of support with that, an acknowledgement around, you know, a timeline, like what's a ramp for this to actually work, and be worth that change, right? And you've probably heard me say a lot, I think change for change's sake is never worth it, but change that results in better opportunities for students is always worth it. But we've got to think about how we design this in a way that's going to be really responsible and supportive of the outcomes that we hope to achieve. Part of that conversation, I think, that has a lot of question marks right now is timeline, right? But I do think if we can focus in on kind of the content around like, would this work? Would this make sense? We can then think through some of the pieces around the timeline that would need to be in place in order to support that type of work. Yes, Nicole.
So I appreciate all that. And am curious how you would or how we should be thinking about responding to, I would say, a pretty consistent theme that we have heard as this work has gotten underway relative to Act 46. And so this idea that achieving scale, which was part of what Act 46 was designed to do, at least from a governance perspective, led to an increase in costs as opposed to, so I think there are some folks who question who believe that Act 46 was a failed experiment. And so achieving scale. So I think a lot of things get conflated. Right. And I do think it's really important to start to respond to and address, you know, what worked about Act 46, what didn't work about Act 46. I mean, in my view, it's a complicated tale in that a lot of political compromises were made from the inception of the law through implementation that potentially undermined some of the goals, and then COVID. So, but I do think we need to be able to point to more than that, and that report that you found that had never been published. But as we talk about scale and disrupting existing governance structures, school sizes, et cetera, that needs to be addressed somehow.
Yeah. So obviously I wasn't here through that process for Act 46. And I would also caution us to make determination, you know, to say with authority that this was a failed experiment or not, right? Or
I haven't done that, but that's what we've been told in public comment.
Right. But I mean, I think part of the challenge here is that there's certain core principles of any strategy that could be really helpful. And the key is figuring out all the details for how we're going to bring that together to be supportive of the goal we're trying to achieve. I think it's very healthy to have debate and to say this was maybe how it's designed in practice or in theory, and then there's a disconnect between theory and action, right? And understanding that disconnect is helpful, and I know that's why it's on the agenda today, to be able to explore that. I don't have key folks from my team on with me today to kind of walk through kind of a summary of that. But I do think the, you know, when we think about Act 46, the idea was largely around governance, right? what I think, what we've been talking about is that a strategy that's really going to get us to where we need to head will be inclusive of funding, governance, programming, right? And probably a couple other things. So I'm not sure that it would be appropriate to assume that one change would be able to address the complexity of the challenges we currently face. Now, the difficulty is recognizing that is pulling together a comprehensive, multifaceted strategy, right, that stays intact in a way that works together to support this. So one of the things to think about just kind of broadly as we think through funding, we are incredibly unique in how the state funds education in Vermont. All 48 other states start with the state saying, here's how much money you have available to provide education to your students. There's different ways that states come up with that formula. And some are based on per pupil, some are based on other factors around the district's demographic needs and so forth. But they all set up front in a cycle, here's the amount of money, so everyone is clear around those budget parameters. And then there's the opportunity for districts to raise additional dollars within their local community. There are other equity mechanisms that are in place in those states that could be considered to ensure that it is fair, right? And so that's a different conversation that I would expect we should and will have in Vermont around this type of a model, because Brigham is really around ensuring that there's equal taxing revenue, right? There's different ways to ensure that, which is a conversation, and we can look at other models for other states. But we're really unique in this regard of the fact that our districts are identifying the amount that would be appropriate to spend, and then the state needs to raise the revenue in order to deliver that. It creates a lot of, it is not a predictable pattern, which I think is part of some of the strains that we face. So the question then becomes, how do you calculate how much to spend? And all states are in some form or fashion pursuing equity and measuring that in specific ways. And they are implementing that in their funding formula differently. And I know our consultants shared a couple different ways that can be imagined. But this goes back to when we think about our funding formula, being really clear on how we're measuring equity at the onset will be important to ensuring that we're developing policy to support that. So again, we've heard this term used a lot in our committee work, but a state typically will set the floor. So they're not setting the ceiling of spending. The question becomes, as you think about fairness across the state, is how can any additional revenue generated by the local community, how do we make sure that that's fairly done across the state? So this is kind of more of an explanation around how we're fund education and how we promote equity. We do have a pooling of cost, and so while there is a lot of local budgeting decisions, that is done within the context of one statewide funding system. And what that can translate to is, even if your school budget stays the same or is reduced, your taxes could potentially go up for a variety of other factors, because we're pooling funds from the entire state. And there's a lot of complexity to that. So one of the things I thought was an interesting takeaway is within Vermont, there's a lot of independence in how much to spend, but less control over how much it will cost local taxpayers because of the pooling of the statewide funds. I think we've also heard a lot from school board members that there are these broad cost drivers that also limit their ability and control at a local level because it's outside of the scope of the school district. Governance also comes into this conversation. We certainly have more school boards in the state of Vermont and bigger school boards. On average, supervisory units have one board member for approximately every 75 students in the state. So there are a lot of really small districts, and sometimes there's even variability. So they're within the supervisory union structure is quite unique in Vermont at face value. And then you think about our supervisory unions are structured differently across the state in terms of the geography that they oversee, in terms of the number of school districts they oversee, and then we also have supervisory districts. So we have a lot of complexity with our overall governance system. And sometimes that can, when you think about some of these broader opportunities to support students or share costs or share programming or negotiate contracts, that can be challenging when you're thinking about that being done at a very localized level. And what that can translate to, and we have seen in our data, is there's a big disparity in terms of teacher pay. And particularly what we see is that in our smaller supervisory unions and supervisory districts that serve higher needs students tend to pay their teachers less than those that have less need. So I know there's been a lot of questions around the practicality of managing larger school systems. So our consultant had shed some light into that based on their experience in working with districts across the country. I would certainly say that there's a sweet spot here, right? And it's really challenging to think about what the right number is, right? How do you define too small? How do you define too big? But the concept around with the right kind of support and structure in place, you can think about overseeing a larger student body. So we go through kind of the election of school board members, that process, and thinking about kind of this concept of at-large membership that kind of represent larger swaths of community while still balancing the localized input, and that sometimes being a challenge when you think about how do we actually make governance decisions for a system, a school system, as opposed to a collection of different schools. Right. And so that's something to think about. And I think goes into the conversation around how do we strike the right balance between unity and freedom. We want to make sure that there's freedom at the local level to really customize and meet the unique needs of their students. And yet we're also hearing a call for greater unity on some of those things that are going to be most critical to driving academic outcomes. And so how do we think about establishing that balance and that alignment within our governance models as well? So just pressing through. Then we talked a little bit about, how our current structure relates to and supports teaching and learning best practices. Because again, I think it's really important when we have these discussions, it's not just about funding, it's about quality for students. So one thing that was noted in our report is we don't have a lot of comparative data. So typically, states will establish really clear benchmarks for performance and goal setting, and may also compare themselves not just within their state, but to other states. We tend not to have those type of benchmarks. And so it's just something to think about as we move forward in making and ensuring that we're all rowing in the same direction to get to that goal. Something that agency is really cognizant about in relation to this goal alignment area is ensuring that we're taking a continuous improvement approach. And we've talked a lot on the commission about the importance of using data to drive improvement and supporting and teaching and learning, as opposed to using comparative data to be seen more as punitive, right? And so I think that's really critical as we think about setting targets. It's important that targets are set in a way that is also supported to getting everyone to that next level and making sure every student has those opportunities. We have very small class sizes. And so one of the things too is we are smaller than the typical class size in that many of our classes are small for deliberate decisions, not necessarily because it's a small school. And so those are just some programmatic conversations that we have. And I know the Vermont Superintendents Association has also been having some discussions around thinking about class size and what is the right number to ensure high quality instruction and learning. We have many classroom teachers, so I think I'll have to go back to the stat, but I think we are ranked number 1 in terms of the most staff per 100 students in the country, but they're at lower pay. So while we tend to have higher expenditures and we tend to have a higher number of staff and teacher positions, they're below the national average in terms of pay. So that becomes a really practical challenge as we think about recruitment and retention of our workforce. We have fewer specialized teachers as well. Overall, we have a number of paraprofessionals and a reliance on paraprofessionals. I know for those of you that were involved in the special education legislation, there were some broader conversations too around how to ensure that we are delivering a high quality special education delivery and thinking about staffing considerations. We will be releasing another report that's a topical report around special education delivery to think about that in terms of just understanding special education, understanding the cost associated with that, and also best practices in terms of delivery. In terms of staffing, when we look at many of our staffing matrices tend to favor full-time staff within a single school. And so we've been doing some budget training to the field around how to, best practices around staffing and aligning staffing to your enrollment and student needs within the classroom and thinking, sharing some resources around that. But there's one of the things I want to say here is our next step is to identify some of the schools and districts that are really being creative with their staffing in ways that we think are illustrative and could be supportive in other areas, because there are many smaller schools and districts where they do share leadership staff and they share programming, and it's done in a way that's really effective, not just from a budgetary perspective, but also from an education quality perspective. And so I think this is the time where we consider where what's good for the taxpayer and what's good for the student are actually aligned in these overall conversations. But again, one of the things too that we talk about is it's not just around a budget conversation. There are really practical challenges right now in terms of staffing many of these positions. And so it's really in our best interest to think about best practices around staffing. We did.
So
yeah.
I'm just sorry. You are full steam ahead, and so I'm trying not to interrupt. But you're very full steam ahead when you're talking right now, which is a quality we might share sometimes. Another thread that I just want to sort of highlight through all of this is what capacity AOE would need, whether that's like changes you would need to make to your existing staffing structure or staffing up that would need to happen in order to support some of these transitions were they to happen. And then I just want to, when we talk about staffing shortages, and like, yes, absolutely. Like we have a teacher workforce shortage. That's true. A lot of that is, generational shifts, right? And a lot of that, particularly in the teacher workforce, a lot of that's also, sort of the general workforce shortages we have in Vermont. And I think it's important to say that these like last 2 years, like the challenge of teaching through COVID and coming out of that and feeling so profoundly unsupported by your community with budget failures, I think is also contributing to the teacher shortage. So I just want to name that I don't think it's entirely about like whether or not there are enough bodies with licenses, and that there's a lot of people who don't want to be in this field anymore because we have made it impossible for them to thrive.
Yeah. We've been having broader conversations outside of, this report around making sure that we're really celebrating the nobility and professionalism of the education field. And there's nothing more important than training our next generation to be productive citizens and lifelong learners, right? And I think it has been a challenging time in education, not just in Vermont, but nationally. And COVID presented some really unique challenges. And we definitely are hearing that many teachers are feeling burnt out. And we've talked a lot as a commission and through our Listen and Learn tour about how are we defining education and recognizing that, it's not just about what's happening, right, within the academic day. And schools are really doing very heroic efforts to promote community and school coordination in a way that is really helping to foster whole child development and providing that wraparound support. So, on another front, the agency is really working intentionally to do more interagency collaboration across the state and thinking comprehensively around how we support youth and child development and education, right? So I do think that's a bigger conversation, but I hear you. We really want those folks to stay in the field. We actually saw another stat recently that we have a lot of licensed special educators that live in Vermont and are licensed and are not serving in those roles, right? And we know that those roles are really important. And so how do we think about making sure that the people are really staying in this profession and are really valued? I do think that pay is a piece of it too. And so as we are looking at opportunities to reimagine our system and reinvest dollars, you'd think with us being kind of the highest spending, we'd also have the highest teacher salaries, and that's not the case. And so I think that's something we really want to be thoughtful around. The role of tuitioning is very unique in Vermont. This is certainly an area where I've learned a lot coming into this role. And so we walked through here, where how tuitioning is structured, how it came about. And also the cost of tuitioning, the benefits of tuitioning, the challenges of tuitioning, and then the specifics around tuitioning out of state. And so in all of these areas, we have noted where there are different nuances that come into play as we think about, for example, the cost of tuitioning. There are some exceptions that we've noted here as well. Certainly the benefits of tuitioning, it originated in very rural communities in Vermont that did not have a public school available, and being able to tuition served a really important purpose. And also currently it doesn't require building a new building as well. So there's those benefits. And then we do have a really interdependent system. We're working next on a report that's really helping to understand that interdependence within tuitioning and those patterns, and creating that heat map. And it's really clear that it's part of our system, and it does create some unique complexity, both within one district tuitioning to another public school district, and also tuitioning can come into place where you have tuitioning to an independent school. So there's a variety of ways that tuitioning actually comes into play in our system to ensure that every student has access to a high quality education and a school option in their community. The out-of-state tuitioning, so there are certain cases where a family who lives in a district that does not operate a school can use the tuitioning of subsidized private school out of state. Approximately about 1% of all students who tuition fall into that category. So that's a very small number, but wanted to note that because that is a unique feature for those specific tuitioning towns. I think, Nicole, you had a question.
Yeah, it's more of an observation on this piece, and maybe you're going to get into it in a different exploration of the tuitioning structure, but I do think it's important to acknowledge and potentially dig into the many other states that have charter schools or some voucher system have requirement for either a lottery system or open enrollment, and Vermont does not have that. And so independent schools are not required to accept students or have sort of blind admissions processes. And so there is a perception and particularly when special education services were not required to be provided, that independent schools were able to sort of select based on mission or, whatever the non-discriminatory criteria are, self-select the students that they serve, as opposed to public schools. So the implication of that is that public schools serve students with a higher set of needs and more complex set of needs. I don't know whether that is, that has not been explored with data, and I think that's an important challenge of our tuitioning system, and potential cost of tuitioning that was not reflected here. And I just hope that it will be an area of exploration, that as public schools in rural areas we've seen have historically less access to resources, if they're serving higher need populations of students because of this sort of selection impact, that's important for us to know as part of the policy conversation.
Yeah. And you referenced charter schools and you noted some of those policies. The reason that those policies are very consistent is because charter schools are public schools and they follow public school policies. So
other
now,
tuitioning type of constructs as well.
tuitioning
Right.
is
Charter
very
schools are
different.
public schools. Independent schools receive vast
Public
amounts, and
schools.
some of them vast amounts of public dollars. They're not public schools. That is a feature of the system that I think needs to be explored in terms of admissions, enrollment, and what impact that has on student bodies served by each type of school.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think part of what we're looking at as we move forward is it is really unique. I would say that the tuitioning practices are very unique in Vermont, and they kind of emerged really before public education really had a stronghold in Vermont, and it was a creative way to be able to deliver education. I think part of what we'll look at is understanding those patterns and understanding those feeding patterns and things of that nature, and how the overall enrollment is interesting to look at. We have not done that type of analysis yet, and it's something that is where we are headed. And I think it would be really helpful to see those patterns. So, what percentage of students from this town are going to this independent school or this independent school? And so just seeing that would be helpful in understanding the choices that parents are making. And it will inform different questions around why they're making that choice, right? Because ultimately, as we look at our education system, it's about making sure that we have really high quality public education options for every student. And that'll be part of that work. And strengthening our system overall is going to be a key piece. But I do want to note that even though it is a very unique part of the Vermont public education system, it's only 4% of our students. So the vast majority of our students are enrolled and attending a traditional public school in Vermont.
But in some regions of the state, there's tremendous regional variation in that.
There is there is regional variation in that. And that's part of why we think it's important to do kind of this mapping, because, and I had noted that in my memo to the board, that while it's only 4%, that's absolutely true. There are geographic patterns in probably the Northeast Kingdom and southern parts of the state that have more interdependence with independent schools being part of the overall ecosystem. So I do think that's important to bring out. Yeah, Mike?
Just some thoughts as you've been talking, and again, probably of all the reports that AOE has produced, this is one I've heard most about because it is a real understandable piece. What I found really interesting is how you and the agency framed the conversation for this whole report. And I'm looking back to page 13, taking a look at kind of what we've talked about so far, what we haven't talked about. And there's a really helpful list of some of the factors that really led to this. And just something else I wanted to point out when we talked about teachers and quality of teachers and supply of teachers, another element for many of us, myself, my district included, is the housing shortage, which there's no place to really talk about that in this report. That's not the purpose of it, but that is also a very real element. Even in a district that is a higher spending school district, we have a tremendous challenge getting educators who can live in the Mad River Valley, because especially newer teachers, because of those costs. So I think that's an important element. And also, you know, as an educator involved in this conversation, I do want to point out the academic achievement piece. And I mentioned a couple of times this conversation, the commission meeting, and other conversations just about the importance of, well, I know our job is to focus on the education finance, but to make sure that there's a structure on the other point that really looks to those elements of a high performing educational system in the state, and making sure that we're designing our education system based on our vision of what we should be providing for students and not the reverse. That's an important element that we have not talked about yet. And I hope to have those conversations starting in January, as I know the steering committee is looking to form a couple of other subcommittees. Declining levels of academic achievement. I've looked at the good data that AOE has provided on that. That's another important element, but I also think it's important that as a commission and as a state, we define what that student success looks like in Vermont. We have limited areas right now to be able to judge that quality. In some of our communities, standardized testing is not something that a lot of emphasis has been put on, and that's not a judgment statement I'm making as someone who's come from a system that put a lot of time into that. That's just another element as well. So I appreciate the conversation, the information. They're just the things that have been going through my mind as you've been discussing those other elements of the report.
Yeah.
I want to give us a time check here. If we were at all following the agenda we started the meeting with, we would be transitioning to our second to last agenda item now. And you're sort of some portion of the way through this, Zoe. So I'm looking to you to see what you're thinking.
I'll push myself to wrap up here. So I do think Mike's point is really important around the context, you know, really grounding us in why we're having this conversation. There's been a lot of changes within the state of Vermont, and we continue to hear as we're working with schools that a lot of the challenges schools are facing in terms of declining enrollment and increased need are representative of the larger community challenges in Vermont. And so, you know, as we are really centering planning for the state through schools, it really makes sense to look at this comprehensively. And we've said, I think Chelsea from the Vermont Superintendents Association said it, I think, best, which was after one of our first commission meetings, she said, you know, it's not the Commission on the Future of Public Education, it's the Commission on the Future of Vermont, right? Because schools are so central to everything in Vermont, and everything in terms of our economy and community building, and housing is part of it, and the workforce shortage all plays part of this, right? So it's really, schools are situated within a lot of the complexity that we're managing through as a state, including, you know, greater needs. We're seeing rising costs overall, not just within education, but housing, and a really big affordability challenge and crisis. So I do think that framing and context is important as we're having these conversations around education. So we've gone through, I'm just going to kind of go through some of the pieces around the actual budgeting, and we've alluded to this earlier in our conversations. One of the things that makes us really unique is our overall timeline. And the reason that it's unique is because of how we fund, whereas most states identify the amount of funding that's available early on in the budgeting cycle. The state actually responds to the budget request from the districts and then raises the money for that. So the timeline, what that means for us is that we're starting our budgets earlier and we're ending our budgets earlier. We're relying on incomplete spending data to build the budget. So again, that creates challenges as we think about being as strategic as possible. We've talked about just the overall structure of our system, and the idea, really the need to have more collaboration and alignment across systems. We certainly, it's important to think about local decision making, but also how do we balance that with understanding the needs of the entire Vermont community of students, and creating that shared ownership and responsibility for all students can be challenging. There's some work that's happening in that respect, and with recent legislation last year with the introduction of the BOCES bill, and really trying to support other types of collaborations across districts. I know we've reflected on that in the commission around that needing to be structured really thoughtfully so that it doesn't create another layer of bureaucracy with an additional cost. And I think that's part of the challenge as we're thinking about the overall structure of our system, is where that fits, and where it may be better served to have more consolidated governance as opposed to another layer of bureaucracy supporting collaboration. So in conclusion, there's a lot of the same challenges we're facing in Vermont, other states are facing in terms of declining public school enrollment, increasing needs of our students, deferred maintenance on facilities, an aging population. All of those factors come together and are creating unique challenges across the country. And I think though, as we talked about some of the future considerations, what I would say is really unique and powerful about where we are in Vermont is the level of investment in education. And by investment, I don't just mean dollar amount. I mean, there is an ethos in Vermont that education is important, and it's demonstrated in so many big and small ways that I've experienced since I've been in the state. But it really has been a privilege to travel around through our Listen and Learn tour, and people are really engaged in this conversation, and it matters. It matters to Vermonters that we are developing and designing a public education system that is really going to meet the needs of our students and prepare that next generation of Vermonters. So I think we have a really great starting point in terms of the level of engagement and also the level of focus on education right now. There's a lot of challenges too as we think about the funding perspective, but I do see, as I've traveled all across the state, that people are really coming together and trying to think about, well, what could we do differently, but doing that in a way that's not just about the funding, but is also about education quality and making sure that we're creating that alignment. So I think this report helps to spell out some of those components that we can look at, and just making sure that we are being comprehensive in nature. But really, as it comes down to it, it's around making some adjustments in terms of our funding, how we fund education, how we deliver education, how we structure education in a way that's going to achieve these desired goals. And Mike's point earlier around how do we really define education quality and student success? I mean, that's really important to get right. Through our Listen and Learn tour, we've been asking those questions of a lot of different stakeholder groups. How do you define student success? We have frameworks already available to us in Vermont through our education quality standards, through our state accountability plan, but it's pulling those pieces together to make sure that it's really representative of what our community desires. And how do we measure it? I think we've articulated a lot of aspirations for our students in terms of a portrait of a graduate, but how do we actually measure that that's happening, and that that's happening in an equitable way across our state becomes a big part of the puzzle. And then Emily, you had addressed something earlier that I didn't mention, which is really, as we think about structure, the structure of the state education agencies. There's not a lot of data on state education agencies, but as we can think about this work, it is really important that we're intentional around looking at structure at all different levels and ensuring that there's the right level of expertise, there's the right expertise at the right level of our system to really maximize the support that's provided in the field. So that was my impromptu presentation upon request.
Thank you. It was top notch. I'm very impressed with your off the cuff, very comprehensive presentation. Thank you very much, Nicole.
Yeah, thank you so much. I guess my question is, what role do you see the commission playing as you think about how to unpack these future considerations, right? Like that is the meat of the matter. and they're big pieces to unpack. And so I'm just interested in how do we ensure we're using our time together in a way that supports that complex conversation.
Nicole, I think that's a really good question, and I really appreciate it. I think it's a conversation that's actually better had in the steering committee than it is in this.
Okay, well, I
committee.
would invite Zoe to come with a recommendation maybe to our meeting next Monday, because I think that is a question I'm going to ask, you know, what role does this commission play moving forward? And I think that's it. I would appreciate your guidance and thinking around that, because as you say, there's a lot of material to work with.
Right.
I think the question is, what's the best way to proceed so that we're supporting the work of the agency, supporting the work of the General Assembly, and not engaged in some parallel process that's not really adding much value.
Yeah, I would
So
ask the steering committee and the commission to reflect on that question. But the way I've been approaching it is, as we as an agency are pulling together this information, we've done this in a very clear pattern. We've brought it to the commission first to get input and to get reflection, and then we've published to the broader community. So we've established a cadence where we've really brought this forward to get that input and be able to incorporate that to then publish to the wider community. And then sometimes, as you know, we've had further conversations where we recognize, like with the first state education profile report, we recognize that there needed to be additional analysis. We talked about the need to unpack the expenditure reporting and looking at it by total, operating, and ed fund. And so we did that with our re-release. So I think from my perspective, I think it has been very collaborative and iterative as we've gotten this input and conversations with the commission. We've been able to incorporate some of that and including it in the reports that we're pushing out. But it's certainly, I think, an important question to ask to make sure that we're all really in alignment. The next report that we will be sharing will be the qualitative themes from our Listen and Learn tour. And some of that feedback will be specific certainly to the agency's strategic plan, but a lot will be talking about these broader themes and how Vermonters are cohering around what the key priorities are and the focus areas. I want to recognize that public engagement never ends. And so even though we'll release this report, we are going to identify that there's more to be done in terms of capturing input from diverse communities across Vermont. And we're being thoughtful around how we can partner with trusted community organizations to do that work. And I think it's important, as we're all, walking forward together, that we're in alignment. So I think it would be a productive conversation to see, how best to create that alignment. And we've all talked about throughout this whole process, leveraging those processes that are in place that are going to be supportive of informing the broader policy work.
Thanks, Zoe. And I do look forward to hearing about what happens in the steering committee meeting. I would offer that if that's the cadence, it's helpful. Like I did not know that was the cadence you were intending. And so I would have made specific agenda time sort of available for that. And we've done that sort of more on an ad hoc basis. And so I think that's the kind of sort of consensual agenda planning that we could all do together in strategic planning if it makes sense for this subcommittee specifically to continue its work. And did I hear you saying that that's going to come out before the special education report, which I am so excited about the special education report. I'm like at the edge of my seat about it. So I'm wondering if you have an update on when that one's going to come out.
The qualitative report will probably come out before the special education report. So the special education report would be more in the January timeframe the next year, but we're working towards it. Yes.
Great. I just really...
We have prioritized that as the next topical report because we know that there have been a lot of questions. I'll keep you updated if that timeline is accelerated. It is, I would say, as complex as the education funding report, right? So I hesitate today to give you a date because as I have experienced through that report, it takes some iterations to get it to where it needs to be. But I hear you, and I've heard from the community that it's really important to prioritize that.
Thank you. So we have, I don't know, like 15 minutes now. Let's talk about next steps first, and then we'll talk about lessons learned. I'm gonna keep on messing with the agenda here because that seems like more of a natural flow from the conversation we're having now. So my assumption is that the steering committee needs to have a conversation about what our purpose is and how we fit into the broader work that's happening. Once this report is finished on the 15th. I think we all already agreed that we were not going to meet at our next, like what would be our naturally next scheduled meeting. And so it feels to me that we essentially like are in something of a holding pattern, waiting to hear from the steering committee about what we want to be doing from there. I would be happy to continue, personally would be happy to continue into the legislative session if that's something the steering committee wants. I think it would be helpful to continue to return to this group as the legislative session moves and those conversations happen, and to have this body as a place to come in and testify even, if that would be of interest to people. But I'm wondering if, I know a few of you are on the steering committee, so sometimes these conversations get like sort of absurdly overlapping, but wondering if other people have thoughts on next steps that they want to share. Great, let's move to the next agenda item. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Nicole.
I think this is the conversation the steering group needs to have next.
Okay, cool. Great.
I would just say I agree, and I'm glad Nicole voiced that concern. That I think my envision was that the commission would be those places where we had conversations and came to some kind of consensus or not, but that we would have conversations to help filter through all those proposals from the various organizations and entities.
Okay, final agenda item. We are such nimble and flexible people, and I am so grateful to all of you for that. Lessons learned from previous legislation. I think this is an incredibly important conversation to have. We are not going to have, and Nicole has been very studious about bringing it up very regularly. We are not going to have enough time to have a comprehensive conversation. I don't know if it makes sense to brainstorm a structure for this conversation first, or brainstorm a like list of legislation and our sort of top hits for lessons learned. I know I have a few of mine, and I know, Nicole, you have a few of yours, but I'm wondering, does anyone have any process suggestions on this conversation? Okay. I'm going to say my top hits, top of mind. I think Act 60 and 68 are like its own beast. And I think there's a lot in between Act 60 and 68 that is worth unearthing, but I don't have anything to share on brilliant hits for that. And then I would hit 46, 173, and 127. And I think I have like very specific lessons learned that I carry around from those three. But are there other sort of top, oh, and healthcare bargaining consolidation. I don't know the bill number for that. Any other, yeah, go ahead, Nicole.
I keep forgetting I don't need to raise my hand. Well, I guess I'm interested in, from a process standpoint, those seem like the greatest hits of the last decade for sure. But is it like our personal opinions and takeaways, or are we looking for a more sort of objective analysis? And in that case, according to who? So I think before we spend a lot of time on each of those, sort of what's the source of truth that we might be relying on in order to identify the lessons learned?
Great question. So I would imagine that we could make a list and we could ask the question, what are sort of the core metrics we would say as what the goals, we would set those, or whatever, what were the goals of this and what do we like want to understand about the outcomes of these? I think one of the lessons of all of them is they happened in somewhat isolation of a very complicated system. And so it's hard to analyze success in all of them because there was a bajillion other things happening. And so like, how much do we write off to, 173? Like, was it all COVID? Was it 32.1% COVID? Who knows? But I think we could sort of have that metrics conversation and then hear from each of our organizations about sort of there's a lot of people at each of your organizations that were there through those that have very clear lessons learned from each of them. And so I think it's worth sharing sort of organizational wisdom. I don't know if I would call it truth, but I think there's definitely wisdom. And I don't know the difference between wisdom and truth anymore at this point in 2024. What do folks think about that?
I think you acknowledge this, Emily. It's really hard to recreate the evaluation and be able to isolate the impact of one specific bill and do that retrospectively. I would say as we go into this and thinking about the different laws, we might want to have a framework for what we're hoping to evaluate. So I was just jotting down a couple notes as you were talking, and it would seem for each that we'd want to clearly identify the intended outcome, what the expectations were in any modeling that might have been done, was the budget, the evaluation framework, and then what were the barriers and strengths. So those seem to be the key buckets of consideration, and I would be interested if there are some common themes that come out, because I think sometimes we evaluate an outcome absent of what it was intended to do, right? And so if we're really going to be disciplined around reviewing the impact, I think we need to be really clear on what it was designed to do, which may be different than what might have been expected also for different stakeholder groups. So I would just ask that we can try to be methodical in creating a framework with how we review it. So, and then I would have some questions too from the analytical piece of it, how we could really recreate that analysis given all the other influences at the time that these specific pieces of legislation were implemented.
I want to offer that one of the most frustrating things about the legislative process is that there is not necessarily a single intended outcome that is articulated for a piece of legislation. Every tax credit actually has to have an intended outcome connected to it, but a single piece of legislation certainly does not. And though we sort of regularly bring that up, there's no sort of existing practice or statutory requirement towards it. And so what we will be relying on for what the intended outcome was is, again, like memories and vibes and wisdom to some degree. There's certainly like the ability to have research into legislative intent. But I think one of the things that's beautiful about the legislative process is there could be people with many, many, many different sort of intentions all driving towards the same outcome or the same process. And I think
I wonder if
is a really good example
when
of that.
we
Go ahead,
talk
Elizabeth.
about yeah, you had talking about the different acts and the different laws over time that we would have on this kind of timeline and trying to talk about what worked well and what didn't. But I think even just last year's entire budget season and legislative session and the example of, placing a cap and a threshold and then having, the Agency of Ed review and that whole design plan that was shared, and then instantly when it hit the field, seeing the result of what that actually did versus what it was intended to do was really quite astonishing. So I think there's a lot that can be learned from that too, and how we can be really careful about, you know, things that we recommend for the legislature to implement or to make into law. I think we need to be really calculated, and that's why I think we're all so reserved and trying to base everything on data and not just data, but modeling things out. So if we're going to change funding formula, if we're going to put a cap on something, we need to model it out before it ever gets even close to becoming part of our law.
And I want to offer on behalf of the folks who did sort of the modeling on 127 that it was a really heavily modeled piece of legislation and had caveats every single time in big bold type, right? Like, we cannot anticipate all of the forces that come in the future. And so this is modeled based on, you know, current data. And so things can be quite modeled and still not anticipate whatever comes.
Well, for me, the biggest takeaway is we've got a number of very complex pieces of legislation then implemented through a hyper-local, hyper-complex system. Whether we can establish what the goals are or not, you know, there was complexity on top of complexity, and very broadly distributed authority and responsibility. That's the system we're in.
Is the thought to kind of identify these key takeaways so that they're built into the future policy? So, you know, data-driven modeling, what are we hoping to recommend through this?
That's my hope. And so there's a few lessons that I sort of carry around from each of these that I'm carrying into my decision-making process in the future. I imagine that other people have some, and I think the more we can sort of verbalize and share those worries even, the better job we'll do coming into this session, where things are going to move fast, likely are going to be quite heightened, and the stakes are really, really high, right? And so I think even more, the more we can say those things out loud to each other and learn them from each other, the more the folks in this room, the folks on the commission, could even just be like holding those truths when we move forward. There's no reason for like me to be walking around with my worries all by myself. That might be exactly the same as Nicole's worries that we could worry at together.
Well, I think they're illustrations of what happens when you tackle one piece of the puzzle and not all the pieces at once, right? So if you just do governance, if you just do program, if you just do funding, you get what you get.
That's a huge one for me. So when we do education policy change without finance change, the likely cost savings get moved to somewhere else rather than be cost reductions as a whole, which might be good for kids. I have no idea, but like that's a reality, right? Generally, when we do statewide bargaining, we wind up raising the level to sort of the top rather than a middle or a bottom, which again, might be great for kids. I don't know, but that's an important thing to know about a dynamic. When something goes through the legislative process that is incredibly contentious at the individual community level and not enough groundwork has been done, individual legislators will pick away at that legislation in order to weaken it to meet their community's needs, right? I think Act 46 is a great example of that. So those are just some that are sort of top of mind for me that I'm carrying around. And I think it would be helpful to do this in a more comprehensive way. And with that, does anyone want to say anything else? We can just end the meeting and thank each other and wish each other a very merry holiday season.
just to clarify, so we're not going to do any more work on that chart. The commission will have that latest version that you shared, Emily. And we'll hopefully have some different language from you, Zoe, that sort of, I think we had talked about, if it's included at all, it would be included as an appendix, and you were going to work with Megan on sort of framing, whether it's a recommendation or a process update, framing that. And then the full commission will decide on Monday whether or not to include it as an appendix. Final decision on that once all the pieces of the report are put together. So that, just so folks are all on the same page about what we've done with that chart.
Thank you. I think that's well summarized. There are a couple of typos in it that I just noticed today after like 80th viewing. So I imagine those will get fixed regardless. And I think that the good work we did here is good work that's going to carry forward, whether it's in the report or not. Zoe, you are working with Megan on final drafts of the report, and the steering committee is going to make decisions about what our next steps as a committee are. Okay.
That's my
Great.
understanding as well.
Okay.
If there's typos, I'm happy to help clean that up and send it to Megan and Zoe and whoever is going to take a look at the grid.
Mike, I want to thank you for, might be the dozenth time, for taking over ownership of that chart. And it would be lovely if you could read through it again for typos. Thank you. I don't understand why at this point in our history of computers, we do not have spell check in Excel, but we still don't seem to. So that would be very nice if you could do that. Thank you.
So I'm happy to take a look at it.
Okay.
Let me know if anyone else here sees anything wrong, and we'll have at least a clean version coming out of this committee for the full commission to look at.
Thanks, Mike.
Thanks, Mike.
I just want to thank you for the conversation. I think complexity was the key word here in the discussion, but I think it was really helpful to be able to have the conversation, and there's certainly more to unpack, but just appreciate everyone's commitment to the work.
Yeah, if we don't meet again, I just want to say, like, it has been a pleasure to work with you all, like, genuinely, and I look forward to doing it again in some other form. Thanks all.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.